Great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center. My name is Shannon, and I'm one of the members of the Worker Co-op, along with Malav and Jazz. Welcome to the bookstore and our space. We run as a worker co-op, non-profit status, and we host events pretty much every other week or every week, depending on what's going on. We opened a week or 2 weeks before the pandemic in 2020 and then shut down for a while. So right now we open 2 days a week from noon until 6 p.m. on a Friday and a Saturday. And usually on those nights or evenings, we have our events, which are often in person as well as online. So today we are honored to have Mark Bray and Kim Kelly with us. Mark's going to talk about his book right here, which is available for sale over there. So very quickly, I'm going to hand this over to them, but I just wanted to say, Mark is the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, which came out a couple of years ago, right? And the Anarchist Inquisition, Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France. The Anarchist Inquisition explores the groundbreaking transnational human rights campaigns that emerged in response to a brutal wave of repression unleashed by the Spanish state to quash anarchist activities at the turn of the 20th century. Kim Kelly, whose book is going to be launched in 2 weeks' time, Fight Like Hell, The Untold Story of American Labor. And it's a book about, Kim will tell you a little more about how the rights of American workers today have, as a result of the countless silenced, misrepresented, or forgotten leaders whose contributions to the workers' struggles have been erased. Kim is telling us the perspective of those particular worker leaders who have been, to some extent, written out of the history as we have them right now. So I'm going to hand this over to Mark. Welcome, everyone. Hand this over to Mark, and then Mark and Kim are going to have a conversation. Mark.
Thank you. So we discussed that we're going to do some maskless talking, if that's all right with everyone. Feels a little weird. But yes, thank you to Making Worlds for hosting us. Thank you, Kim, for talking to me again. And thank you all for coming out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the book is about in general, so you have some context for our conversation. I'm going to read a little excerpt, and then we'll take it from there. So you heard a little bit, but basically the gist of the book, I would say, is three things. Number one, at the turn of the 20th century in Western Europe, anarchists bombed things and assassinated heads of state, prime ministers, presidents, kings, etc., etc. The French and Spanish states got really mad about this and used it as an excuse to lock up hundreds of people, unionists, radicals, as a kind of excuse to clamp down on the labor movement, really. In response to that, transnational campaigns were organized in Europe that spread to North Africa and the Americas that I argue should be considered as part of the history of human rights. That's the three things: bombs, repression, campaigns. That's the general trajectory. So what I'm going to do here to get things rolling is I'm going to read an excerpt from the first chapter about an anarchist named Paulino Payas who threw a bomb at a general during a religious procession. As the blaring of the Bourbon trumpeters marching down the Gran Via in Barcelona on September 24th, 1893, faded into the shouts and vivas of the throngs of ebullient onlookers, General Arsenio Martinez Campos sat comfortably atop his steed, reviewing an oncoming squadron of lancers. In other words, the general was on a horse. From the balconies above, heads tilted to get a glimpse of this unusual spectacle of military grandeur in celebration of the fiestas of the Virgin of Mercy. Martinez Campos, the general, later recounted, however, that at around 12:30 p.m., merely a half an hour into the day's festivities, the satisfaction, the military spirit, and good demeanor of our lancers, when at the instant they passed in front of me, I was surprised by a very powerful detonation, accompanied by a large cloud of smoke, running and shouting, end quote. Since the general was, quote, a little hard of hearing, he assumed there had been an accidental artillery explosion, but instants later he heard and felt another blast that knocked him off his horse. Moments earlier, a police officer noticed a man push out of the crowd onto the street and advance toward Martinez Campos. As an aside, you can tell from how this description is how bad the police were at doing their jobs. The police officer saw a guy walk towards the general and was like, what's going on here? So anyway, while the officer was, quote, asking himself...
They needed to be better funded.
Phone the police. Ooh, okay. Was asking himself what the subject was up to, the man hurled 2 Orsini bombs at Martinez Campos. Orsini bombs are basically grenades. They exploded at the feet of his horse, mutilating the animal, too bad, but only slightly injuring the general. 2 nearby generals received minor contusions, but a civil guardsman had his leg blown off and died shortly thereafter. The bombing caused 1 death and 16 injuries, some quite severe, such as a spectator who had her leg amputated. The explosions and screams triggered a wave of frenzied panic. Quote, this is from a newspaper, not my language, the newspaper language. The multitude, crazy, blind, ran in opposite directions, knocking over everything, falling here, smashing into benches, trees, clogging up doorways and stores, forming legitimate human mountains. Another quote, some of the soldiers remained immobile, stupefied. Others broke formation as if they were ready to run. Others here and there, as if ripped by panic, pointed their rifles at the people. But rather than take advantage of the chaos to escape, right after the explosion, the bomber threw his cap up in the air, shouting "Viva la Anarquía," and stood still as the police seized him. His name was Paulino Payas La Torre, and he had just unleashed the first major atentado, which is Spanish for attack. It's a term that was used frequently at the time, in a series of shootings, stabbings, and explosions that would earn Barcelona the reputation of the city of bombs over the next decade and a half. So I'm going to say a few more things before we start chit-chatting. I think it's worthwhile talking a little bit about propaganda by the deed as a phenomenon. So the term propaganda by the deed, no doubt some of you are familiar, and no doubt some of you are not. It's a euphemism that anarchists used, and in some cases still use, to describe attacks on symbols of authority. So at the turn of the 20th century, some notable examples, President McKinley was killed by an anarchist. I think 3 prime ministers of Spain were killed, the president of France, the king of Italy, the queen of Austria, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a kind of strategic mode that was argued for primarily by what might be called insurrectionary anarchists, anarchists who were generally hostile to formal organization outside of the small affinity group of like a dozen people or so. And so they were a minority within the anarchist movement, but a significant minority. I think, though, that when historians have written about anarchism and propaganda by the deed, they've clarified that. They've said, yes, this was a small minority within the movement. On the one hand, you have the insurrectionary anarchists who usually at the time subscribed to anarchist communism. If you're curious about that, we can talk about them more later. And on the other end, you have sort of anarchist unionists who, in their rejection of insurrectionary tactics, often went in the direction that we would find kind of conservative, to the degree where they would like reject illegality writ large, right? But what I found in my research is that you had a very significant part, not only of the anarchist movement, but of the working class society in general, that was somewhere of a gray area in the middle, that would be sympathetic to certain kinds of bomb attacks, depending on who the target was, whether there was collateral damage, the context, et cetera, and critical of others. And so I think that far too often, by trying to either put historical subjects into a yes or no box, we miss that kind of nuance in the middle. Because, for example, the bombing that we just read about was actually pretty popular, it seems, among the Barcelona working class. For example, lithographic portraits were printed of Paulino Payas that were sold on the Rambla in Barcelona. And they were selling so well that the police forcibly shut down the kiosks and confiscated the portraits because they didn't want this figure to be glamorized. He was sorry to like spoil it, or they executed him. When he was killed and they buried him, so many people visited his grave in an homage of what he had done that the authorities were concerned that they were going to dig up his body. Part of the reason why there was that concern is that there is this religious tradition in Spanish history of the bones of martyrs, or like in a religious context, being sacred. And so like, you know, you see some overlap between radical politics and religion and so forth. So I think it's interesting to think about propaganda by the deed in this time of place as something that was a little bit more, whose meaning was a little bit more contested than we might imagine in retrospect. And the other kind of major piece of this I want to just lay out before we talk is thinking about the relationship between human rights and terrorism, quote unquote. I'm reticent to use the term, but I use it as a shorthand just to sort of quickly reference what we're talking about. Because what we see in the campaigns that anarchists and their allies organized to release their imprisoned comrades is that the threat of reprisals was an implicit and sometimes explicit part of the equation. So in other words, a lot of times speakers, anarchists, socialists, you name it, would say the Spanish state should release these prisoners. Because if they don't, you know, some desperate person is just going to take it into their own hands. So really, you should do it. And after a while, the Spanish state, there's documentary evidence, was increasingly concerned about this happening. And there are cases of instances where the repression seems to have been less because they were concerned that if they started rounding people up, it would get out of hand. And the breaking point was this campaign that started in 1896, went till 1900, which for a shorthand I call the Munch week campaign, because that was the castle where people were locked up. So I'm going to briefly describe what that was, why it's important, and then I'll sit down. So in the early 1890s, anarchists keep blowing things up, more people keep getting arrested. There's this kind of, you know, if you were to put it on a kind of a chart, this increased repression in response to anarchist attacks. Outside of anarchist circles, no one cared about repression, no one cared about allegations of torture. Unfortunately, not a surprise, right? In 1896, a bomb is thrown into a religious procession in Barcelona. In retrospect, a lot of anarchists argued that it was a police provocateur because the bomb exploded at the end of the procession where they were regular everyday people, not at the front where the important people were. Although in retrospect, it seems probably more likely that the guy who threw the bomb just screwed up, but we can talk about that later. Anyway, in response to that, somewhere between 400 and 800 people are arrested. Some of them are tortured, some of them are executed. The imprisoned anarchists managed to smuggle out letters describing their torture by sewing the letters into the clothing of some of the prisoners who were sick and had to go to the infirmary in another facility. These letters get to the press and it starts this big campaign that lasts 4 years and is ultimately successful. A key part of the campaign is that in 1897, an Italian anarchist named Michel Angiolio assassinates the Prime Minister of Spain, Cánovas del Castillo. And this is significant because Cánovas del Castillo was the person overseeing this repression in Spain and also overseeing a genocide in Cuba, the use of concentration camps, which killed approximately 400,000 people in Cuba. When he's assassinated, and to be clear, this Italian anarchist said he did it to avenge his comrades in Spain and in Cuba, the liberal who replaces him reversed his courses on both accounts. He releases a bunch of the prisoners in Spain. He ends the policy of reconcentration in Cuba. So I think you could make the case that it's arguably the most successful example of historical propaganda by the deed because of tangible repercussions. But this campaign changes the equation. After this campaign, which is successful, it eventually gets all the prisoners out that survived. Over the coming decade, there's another 5 campaigns that are similar to this, that use this kind of newly awakened public consciousness in Spain, France, and elsewhere that basically argues we need to make sure that anarchists are not tortured and wrongfully accused because they're sort of the canaries in the coal mine, that it's a reflection of the values of our society. And so I situate that within a kind of a history of human rights. If it's strange to think of anarchism and human rights, ask me a question because it's an interesting topic. But I think I'm gonna, for the formal remarks, I'm gonna leave it at that. And then we'll talk. So.
Yeah, it sounds like we will be having a Q&A afterwards because that was a very leading.
Yeah, well, you know, I tried to tease of the audience. Do you think we need these or? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think Well, I came in with a couple of questions, and then after hearing you say all that, I have more questions. But first, just to keep it light, let's talk about propaganda. And the fact that, so the first place that I encountered that phrase was reading about the Chicago Anarchist and how people inspired by Johann Most, who I think was German, right? Like a German anarchist. He's the one who kind of coined this idea, propaganda by the deed. Do something spicy, and then that'll inspire the people to rise up. And clearly, sometimes it worked, but in the U.S., it didn't really. Like, we had, the assassination of McKinley. We had poor Sasha Berkman trying to take out Henry Frick, which did not go well. It was not really a tactic that was, utilized in a useful way in the States. And conversely, your book is just a whole parade of examples of it working much differently.
Well,
or at least it caught on. It's a little more, basically, why did it become such a big thing there? And why, if you have any opinions on it, why did it fizzle so hard in the States?
Yeah, so I'll say a few words about sort of where it came from, and then where I went. So the earliest kind of notion that's resembling propaganda by the deed that I found was from a Russian revolutionary named Dmitry Karakazov, who attempted to kill the Tsar in the 1860s. And he called what he did factual propaganda, which is not the same phrase, but it had the same meaning, because when he failed. The Tsar was assassinated in the early 1880s, but in the 1860s he failed. And when he was arrested, he was asked, like, well, why did you do this? And he said, I have no problem with the Tsar as a person. I'm sure he's a great guy, but I attacked him to target his position and what he represents and so forth and so on. So like some historians who have made the argument that we can sort of distinguish the pre-modern regicide who would target the leader because they didn't like that specific leader from what scholars have called the modern terrorist, although again, I think that term, because of its political connotations, is more counterproductive than useful, because the quote-unquote modern terrorist targets the system with their act, or so some have argued, right? So this notion of factual propaganda in the 1860s, I think, is a really kind of prefigures what becomes propaganda by the deed. But when the term is coined in the 1870s by some Italian anarchists, they initially mean it as sort of like the Paris Commune. For them, that's the epitome of propaganda by the deed. Like, let's do it. Let's make a revolution. Let's not wait. They didn't initially mean it as individuals or small groups throw bombs. That interpretation caught on a bit later and became the predominant interpretation, Johann Most and others promoting it. Why it caught on, I think in some national contexts it caught on in the anarchist movement because the anarchist movement in some contexts had become relatively estranged from the labor movement by the 1880s and 1890s. And so increasingly anarchists argued that we shouldn't do the painstaking work of organizing workers. We should just try to provoke a revolution now, and one way we can do that is with bombs. In Spain, though, the lineage was different because the anarchists were really never during this period significantly estranged from the labor movement. It was because in the late 1870s, the movement was made illegal and they had to go underground and they couldn't organize anything legally. And so, they wanted to do something. And so the propaganda by the youth took off because there was no other option. In 1881, the civil liberties are restored, and they can, right? So there's sort of a faction of the movement that organizes this big union called the FTRE, which is around from 1881. And it's a sort of strange union. On the one hand, it has positions that we would consider almost ultra-left, and on the other hand, positions that we would consider strangely conservative. So on the one hand, they rejected strike funds, and they rejected strikes for better wages. This sounds weird, right? They rejected strikes for better wages because they were concerned about the unionism sliding into bread and butter unionism. They figured if we strike for better wages and God forbid we get them, then people are going to become complacent. So they argued we only do defensive strikes to hold on to our position, and we organize for a general strike. That's it. They argued. This strategy didn't actually end up really working out as well as they intended. And we don't organize strike funds because we don't want people to be comfortable while they're striking. We want them to be desperate and to take up arms and to topple the state and capital. you know, I don't think I need to like go into like the problems with these positions. But and on the other hand, they also completely rejected what might be sort of glibly referred to as criminality. So there was this case in the 1880s where some anarchists were accused of like killing some rich people or something like that, and they condemned it. We could condemn illegality, get anything short. If it wasn't the revolution, everything had to be illegal. And so on the other hand, you have these struggling campesinos in Andalusia where there was much less room for legal organizing, being like, to hell with this. We're going to take up arms against our bosses. We don't care if you like it or not. And the other thing was that in that union, you had to get permission from the directorate to launch a strike. So it was very kind of hierarchical despite its anti-authoritarian politics. Yeah, I know you're shocking, right? It's a really strange constellation of positions. So out of this, the kind of propaganda by the deed reemerges in this anarchist communist milieu. Overall, the cases in the book of using it are predominantly counterproductive. They don't spark the revolution they wanted to spark. They elicit a lot of repression. True, the propaganda by the deed sometimes helps to push back against the repression, I argue, but of course it's repression that only happens in these contexts because of the propaganda to begin with. So if you're assessing the strategy as a whole, it's not as if like, it's overall a net negative. And just a few more comments before I turn it back over to you is, by the first decade of the 20th century, anarchists start to see it as so counterproductive, in part because of one strange thing that happens, which I know you're going to really enjoy hearing about, so I'm going to tell you about it, is that there's this ex-anarchist who essentially makes propaganda by the deed into a family business. Okay, so tell me more, right? Yeah. So there was this guy, Juan Rule, who was part of anarchist circles in the middle of the first decade of the 20th century. He gets arrested, he gets turned into an informer. He basically gives up on his politics, and he's looking to make some money. So what does he do? He goes to see the governor of Barcelona, and he says, if you pay me, I will tell you all about all the propaganda by the deed stuff, infiltrate all that there's no bombs go off. The governor says, you got a deal, here's money. Months go by, bombs don't explode. The governor says, do I really need to pay this guy? And he says, yeah, I'm cutting you off, go away. And so in order to justify his salary, he and his family members and friends start setting off bombs. This is a true story. And then he comes back to the governor and says, you see, like without me, it's anarchy, right? So the governor, strangely enough, says, you're right, take whatever you want. So he gives him a salary. He also puts some of his family members on the payroll. He gives them an apartment. It turns into like a gambling pad for him and his friends. And it lasts for a while until eventually the authorities put two and two together and they're arrested and he's executed. But in this context, even the symbolism of the act is lost because not only is it not tied to politics, they're setting bombs off in markets and streets with no political calculus. They actually, this is a bit of an aside, and my editor, why did you put them? They start installing public, essentially, they're not porta potties because they're kind of permanent, but like public bathrooms on the Rambla, and some of the bombs he puts in the bathroom, so there's like this debate, like, should we be having this place? So the point is, it becomes really counterproductive, and that's when anarchists, syndicalist union that precedes the CNT, which some of you may be familiar as the anarcho-syndicalist union. That was a big deal in the Spanish Civil War, so they sort of a shift away from it because it's like kind of got out of hand. That having been said, even in the context of the CNT over the coming decades, there were times when essentially what you could argue was propaganda by the D tactics were carried out as part of pseudo-Civil War labor struggles, and then I think it has a bit of a different signification and a different conversation, as opposed to acts carried out by individuals, small groups, when there isn't that kind of larger struggle going on.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about like the labor aspect specifically, just because I mean, in fairness, I just read a whole really long book about labor in America. Like you said, the constellation of positions that were held, and just comparing them to what was going on in the U.S. labor movement, pretty wild. There's a lot of
different context, yeah.
Context, very different vibes, I would say.